I'm delighted to be here, and we're having a really good time so far. So let's see. So yeah, becoming capable of the world. I want to talk about Corbin's great book, Creative Imagination and the Sufism of Ibn Arabi. It seems to me to be his masterwork, and I often suggest that people begin their study of Corbin with it. And it's where I began almost 30 years ago now. I've had occasion to work my way through parts of it again several times in the last couple of years, and I can still recall my confusion on first trying to enter it. I belatedly recognize that my process of reading and thinking about the world it occupies has been one decades-long tahwil. Reading it is a spiritual hermeneutic. So I want to begin by saying a few words about that reading. To begin with, it isn't at all clear what kind of a book it is. It doesn't fit very well into any particular category, but it somehow overlaps with many. It's all of these at once: philosophy, history of religion, theology, a bit of psychology, a little biography, some mythology, and a certain idiosyncratic genre of poetry. It has its place, perhaps a little awkwardly, among the world's great works of visionary writing. It's a bit of an outlier among them because of the scholarly format and apparatus. Some of its most important and moving passages are in the footnotes, and personally I find that to be one of its great attractions. The question that formed for me early on, but remained inarticulate for a long time, was this: what is this book, and where is this man standing that he could write such a thing? And implicitly, how do I get there? In a sense, this is a question of genre that arises for the reader of any text. Usually there isn't much question. You know from the start if you're reading fiction or biography or history and so on. But we can think of Corbin as kind of a forerunner of recent writers who consciously challenge and disrupt expectations of how to interpret, how to read, how to understand. In the language of semiotic theory, and I just learned this, he tends to move about in multiple regimes of enunciation all at once. Bruno Latour describes these regimes in a way perfectly fitting for Corbin. He writes, "Like a musical score, the regime of enunciation merely indicates the tonality, the key in which one must prepare to play the next part." This fluidity of style is essential to Corbin's way of thinking and feeling. Once you realize the inherent ambiguities of his texts, it becomes possible to see him as one of the great poetic minds of world literature. He stands firmly in the grand tradition of European Romanticism, with his roots in Hamann, Schelling, Schleiermacher, Novalis, Goethe, and so on. Reading this book properly, engaging in the interpretations it invites, requires what Keats famously called negative capability, the capacity of being in uncertainties, mysteries, doubts, without any irritable reaching after fact and reason. When you open this book, you're entering the unknown. If you'd read just the right books in preparation, this feeling could have been minimized, but I wonder if anyone ever has. It seems to begin straightforwardly enough by quite plainly stating its intent. The subject is the central pillar of Romanticism, imagination. And in the very first paragraph we find, "We shall be speaking of an absolutely basic function, correlated with a universe peculiar to it, a universe endowed with a perfectly objective existence and perceived precisely through the imagination." The first time I read this, I was a little perplexed. At a minimum, it suggests quite an idiosyncratic view of ontology and epistemology. What does he mean by objective? And what kind of perception is produced by imagination? All I know to begin with was that the book was written in the middle of the 20th century by a French scholar who lectured at Eranos. What context, what regime of enunciation gives these words their meaning? Poets and artists might more or less agree with such a statement, but they neither think nor speak in these terms. I didn't at the time know of any philosophers who would say such a thing. The ones I knew of didn't speak of imagination in those terms or at all. In the next paragraph, he further disoriented me by an appeal to phenomenology. We read there that today, with the help of phenomenology, we are freed from an old impasse to say that the imagination or love or sympathy or any other sentiment induces knowledge, and knowledge of an object which is proper to it no longer smacks of paradox. On the contrary, I was indeed smacked by paradox. It didn't sound like any phenomenology I had been taught. He clearly knew his Husserl, as evidenced by a reference to phenomenological parentheses, and that conferred some authority on him in my mind. And not long after, I discovered that he not only had read Husserl, but was the first French translator of Heidegger, and that gave him the imprimatur I needed in order to take him really seriously. But to begin with, I really didn't know what to think. It was quite an attractive proposition. Imagination induces knowledge of an object proper to it. So does love. So does sympathy. Those are wonderful ideas. And I was willing to play along. As I turned the page, I read that the present book invites us into the company of some as yet unnamed spiritualists, and that I found a bit worrisome. I was not convinced I wanted to be in their company. And then in the second line on page 2 came a real shocker. I was told that the universe of pure intellectual perception, whatever that might turn out to be, is the universe of the cherubic intelligences. Oh dear, where did that come from, and how on earth was I to interpret it? Clearly not according to any of the criteria that I had at my disposal. What is going on here? That's a real, live, difficult, hermeneutic question. It begins as an intellectual question because this is a book that appears to be a work of scholarship, and it requires quite a lot of background knowledge to make sense of most of it. It is certainly a book that demands intellectual concentration, but if you're willing to take it seriously, then something more is needed. Reading and understanding it requires the spiritual hermeneutic that is its subject. It really isn't about imagination. It's a book which exists in imagination. For Corbin, imagination is reality. This explains the fluidity, the imprecision of the genre of the thought. In order to read it, you can't interpret it from any single point of view, within any single frame of reference, with any single set of critical criteria. You have to engage it openly at every step. You have to be willing to forge ahead in places where you are at a loss. From too little background on your own part, from failures of presentation and clarity on Corbin's part, and from the inherent difficulty and obscurity of the subject matter. You must sally forth undaunted until you're brought up short by something thrilling, something beautiful. And you have to work hard to become capable of reading this book. Let's begin by diving deep into one of Corbin's great footnotes. The sentence which leads us to it actually has 2 footnotes, and it reads as follows. Though we speak with Max Scheler of the cognitive function of sympathy, at this point we encounter footnote 9, which is simply a citation of Scheller's The Nature of Sympathy, and if I'd read Scheler, I would have been more prepared for Corbin, who continues, we actually have in mind a divination that surpasses actual reality because it is the meaning of virtual existences. End of sentence. And footnote 10, which is to be found on page 290. When we turn there, we find a note that runs for nearly 4 pages in which Corbin expresses his great debt to Etienne Souriau, a contemporary at the Sorbonne whose work had been until very recently almost completely forgotten. Souriau was 10 years older than Corbin, held a chair in philosophy, and was known to many as the co-author, along with his daughter, of a major volume on aesthetic theories. But he was a prolific writer and the author of nearly 20 books and dozens of essays. One of his chief concerns was the nature of artistic creativity. The audacity and range of his thought is astonishing, and his work has lately been resuscitated thanks to Isabelle Stengers and Bruno Latour, although, as Latour points out, he had not gone utterly unnoticed. Even Gilles Deleuze belatedly acknowledged his debt to Soriot. Latour's enthusiasm rivals Corbin's, and he tells us, Latour does, that Soriot invented a metaphysics of multi-realism, of a variety of modes of being, completely from scratch by means of a stupendous freedom of expression. Corbin refers explicitly to and quotes from 3 of Soriot's many books: The Different Modes of Existences, which has been translated into English recently, To Have a Soul, an essay on virtual existence, and The Shadow of God. Only the first has been so far translated. In note 10, we find that Soriot is the source of the wonderful phrase, the angelic function of beings. This function is described by another of Soriot's locutions, which Corbin also enthusiastically adopts. The angelic function is to make it possible for us to become capable of God. At the root of the question, common to all of these writers, is the nature of creativity. How are we to understand the mode of being of virtual existences, that is, of beings whose creation is in process? For Soriot, the central example is the work of art, and the nature of what he calls the angel of the work to be made, which is, as Corbin says, a modern idea of the angel. And he then quotes Soriot. To respond to the angel of a work is to render oneself capable of the entire content of its aura of love. That's Soriot writing about the artist working and the looker looking, or the listener listening. To respond to the angel of a work of art is to render oneself capable of the entire content of its aura of love. But there's more at stake than works of art. For Corbin, certainly, all beings are in a state of perpetual creation. The wonderful thing about the cosmology Corbin champions is that everything is shimmering with virtuality. There are no final, completed entities anywhere. That is the deep significance of his angelology. Soriot speaks of the existential incompletion of every being, and he writes, "Nothing, not even ourselves, is given to us other than in a sort of half-light, a penumbra in which only incompleteness can be made out, where nothing possesses either full presence or, I meant to skip this, or evident patuity, which would require a long footnote, where there is neither total accomplishment nor plenary existence. So everything exists in a sort of half-light." As Corbin says, we are the subjects of a verb in the imperative. God says, be. We have to participate in being in order to be more than a sketch that demands to be completed, as Soriot put it. We not only have to become capable of God, but of ourselves and of the world. To attain to that capability requires that we avoid dangers on 2 fronts, one near at hand and another rather distant. We are, Corbin says, forever threatened by a twofold idolatry. We can, on the one side, be immobilized by an object without transcendence. He says this could be a god or a dogma. It could indeed be any fixation. The problem is with the immobilization. This is idolatry as literalism, the desire for the immutable, the changeless, the absolute, the permanent. This is this. Full stop. meaning and being, both nailed down and safely circumscribed. This is the central core of Corbin's critique of all fundamentalisms. We all have some, and we know what they feel like. They live where we are angry, fearful, anxious, frozen, unimaginative, and very sure of ourselves. On the other side, the peril lies in a misunderstanding of transcendence. The mistake is to imagine transcendence as if it were a destination, a place, or a thing of some kind, so far distant from the objects and persons of this world that contact is impossible. All the arrows are pointing upward. That means that this world must be merely immanent and unworthy of ultimate concern or attention. We will think the hearts of the faithful should yearn only for God. This world and its creatures can't truly be loved. Corbin warns us that this misapprehension of transcendence creates a gulf between it and the object of love and condemns us to asceticism with all its furies and rejections. Because we do so much want to love this world. But if it is so fleeting and the divine is so distant and so perfect and so much more worthy of our love, then we're condemned to hold in check all our passions, our loves, our enchantments, our hopes, all of which must be sublimated upwards. Both aspects of this twofold idolatry are the result of one mistake. If we imagine a gulf between transcendence and the world, then of course there can only be objects without transcendence here. In Corbin's cosmology, there's no chasm between immanence and transcendence. But more fundamentally, he's pointing us to a fact that should be obvious. Immanence and transcendence aren't things or places. Our language misleads us. Properly speaking, these adverbs refer to modes of being, and being is a verb. In this cosmology, immanence and transcendence are modes of being that are continuous. There is no gap, no chasm. All beings express transcendence. It is their virtuality, their shimmer, their instability, their changeableness. It can be sensed by the organ of perception that is the imagination. But even when we understand this much, we can remain trapped in the prison of asceticism. The misunderstanding of transcendence isn't only a problem because of the gulf between some illusory here and an illusory there. It isn't only the chasm that's the problem, it's the direction of the arrows. One result of that destructive vision of transcendence is that it causes us to fixate on only one of the two essential movements in the perpetual creation that Corbin describes. We think only of the upward thrust of resurrection, the nostalgic longing for return to the origin, which is, in fact, the meaning of Tahwil. But Corbin is a theologian of cyclical time. He imagines in cycles and circles. The relation between creator and creature is a twofold intra-divine movement, he says, of perpetual descent of the divinity into manifestation and the ascent of the creatures in their angelic function. Let's think about those downward arrows. I have often complained that Corbin many times left me feeling as if he was trying to drag me off to heaven before I was ready. I have also often argued against my own interpretation. I've argued that his fondness for what he called a Gothic style of cosmology and the wonderful idea of the angel out ahead, leading us forever onward, should not lead us to underestimate the force of the spirituality of immanence, so often expressed in his work. But recently, I was stunned to discover just how right and how wrong I had been, and how powerfully he grounds his imagination in this world. It happened as I was rereading this very footnote on Souriau and the angelic function of beings. He quotes Souriau's idea of the creative act as a quote, universal emancipation of being, an acquiescence in each being's exercise of its right to existence in the measure of its capacity. That's Souriau, the art critic, thinking of works of art is primarily what he's thinking of, and that the imagination is an emancipation of these modes of being, an acquiescence in each being's exercise of its right to existence. Then Corbin calls us to remember the creation myth he's presented earlier in this book. God says, I was a hidden treasure, I yearned to be known, that's why I produced creatures, in order to be known in them. And Corbin comments, this phase is represented as the sadness of the divine names, suffering anguish in non-knowledge, because no one names them. And it is this sadness that descended in the divine breath, which is compassion and existentiation. The beginning, the creation, is determined by love, he says, which implies a movement of ardent desire on the part of him who is in love. This ardent desire is appeased by the divine sigh. The downward movement is determined by love. I think I never really got that into my heart. I knew it was part of Corbin's vision, but I never quite clearly saw the dynamic. I never imagined it from the point of view of the angels, the names. So to repeat, in his footnote, Corbin gives us Souriau's idea of creation as universal emancipation of being, an acquiescence in each being's exercise of its right to existence. And then he says, how can one fail to see a consonance with the idea of the divine nostalgia, the sigh of compassion, which frees from their sadness the divine names, yearning in their pure virtuality for the concrete being that will manifest them. Seen this way, from above, the whole cosmology has a different feeling. The names are yearning downward. The world is born out of love for the beings who are to realize, to make concrete, to existentiate, as Corbin likes to say, who make real and embody the angelic beings from whom they issue. In order to know this world, and to know this world in this way, we have to make ourselves capable of that experience. This is what the imagination accomplishes. It makes us capable of the world. It makes me rather sad to say, but so many people seem incapacitated and unable to experience the glories and beauties and mysteries that lie ready to hand everywhere, always, all around us. It takes only a bit of the right kind of attention, really. Northrop Frye, in his great book on Blake, long ago described the poet's stance towards reality, his mode of being, in words that apply here. He wrote, the more we put all we have into everything we do, the more alive we are. The world is more real to us if we throw our entire imagination behind our perception. Becoming capable of God equally involves becoming capable of the world. The pages to which the footnote on Souriau and the angelic function of beings is appended provide the context for Corbin's homage. The setting for the spiritual drama is an animated natural world wholly open to the perception of the heart, which the imagination provides. He tells us of Proclus, the late Neoplatonist, and his vision of the cosmic sympathy that ties all creatures to their transcendent source. This dialectic of love explains the movement of the flowers of the heliotrope as they follow the path of their lord, the sun, across the sky. Proclus says that if we could hear the sound of the plant as it moves through the air, we should be aware that it is singing a hymn to its king, such as it is within the power of a plant to sing. He points to the lotus flower who opens at sunrise and closes in the evening and asks, what difference is there between the human manner of praising the sun by moving mouth and lips and that of the lotus, which opens its petals? They are its lips, and this is its natural hymn. These passages were translated into Latin 1,000 years later by Marsilio Ficino, who tells us that he delighted in so many examples from the lives of animals, plants, and minerals, and in the parallel hierarchies of angels, daimon, men, animals, plants, and minerals, all vying with one another in their religious ascents. This grand ecology of sympathies is the context for Corbin's appeal to Souriau's vision of the angelic function. So he's got the arrows going in both directions and applying very specifically to the natural world as well as the human. There are three pivotal moments in Corbin's writings that together outline the shape of his cosmology. The first is a meditation written by the shores of Lake Siljan in Sweden in August of 1932, when Corbin was 29 years old. He called it Theology by the Lakeside, and here are some brief excerpts. It will soon be dusk, but for now the clouds are still clear, the pines are not yet darkened, for the lake brightens them into transparency. Everything is green with a green richer than pulling all the organ stops in recital. It must be heard seated, very close to the earth, arms crossed, eyes closed, pretending to sleep. For it is not necessary to strut about like a conqueror and want to give a name to things. It is they who will tell you who they are, if you listen, yielding like a lover. For suddenly for you, in the untroubled peace of this forest of the north, the earth has become a person, visible as an angel that would perhaps be a woman. And in this apparition, this greatly green and thronging solitude, the angel too is robed in green, the green of dusk, of silence, and of truth. Then there is in you all the sweetness that is present in the surrender to an embrace that triumphs over you. At each moment where you read in truth, as now, what is there before you, where you hear the angel and the earth and woman, then you receive everything in your absolute poverty. You are the poor one. You are man, and he is God, and you cannot know God or the angel or the earth or woman. You must be encountered, taken, known, that they may speak. Otherwise, you're alone. The opening synesthetic metaphor of music and color is a key to understanding his cosmology. He thought in and seems to have lived by means of musical metaphors. Harmonies, rhythms, and resonances structure the architecture of the cosmos in synchrony with light and darkness. Spatial and temporal metaphors are misleading and limiting. In outlining Zoroastrian creation myths, Corbin writes of a sonorous space in which the voice of the Creator vibrates eternally in musical motifs. He takes the idea of heavenly choirs of angels entirely seriously. Real thought must be alive, as music is, and occurs most authentically with and through the voices and actions of persons. Thinking, to be more than a waste of time, always culminates in what he calls dramaturgy. The spiritual, philosophical, or intellectual quest culminates in a visionary recital. The musical term is very much on purpose, an account of events in the mundus imaginalis. This is the theater of creation. Speech tends towards song, and thought tends towards story. This personal and harmonic underpinning helps lead us towards an apprehension of one of his fundamental intuitions. Abstract concepts are only the dead bodies of angels. For Corbin, as for Swedenborg and the Islamic mystics he presents to us, the higher realms are populated with celestial versions of all the beings we see here below. For example, in Spiritual Body and Celestial Earth, Sheikh Abul Qasim Ibrahimi writes, in the Barzakh, in the interworld, there are, in a perfectly concrete state, heavens and earths, elements, continents, seas, the natural kingdoms, humans, animals, plants, minerals, all corresponding to those we see in our earthly world. Every being has an angel, and that confers some measure of personhood on all things. It's because of this that Corbin say it is not necessary to strut about and give a name to things. It is they who will tell you who they are if you listen. Knowing is always personal because everything is personified. That personhood may be dim and difficult for us to discern, but that's why listening is necessary. Naming will only ever give you objects to be known. The real knowledge is not information. You don't have it as if it were a currency to be traded. Strictly speaking, there really is no knowledge. There is only ever knowing. Knowing is communion. It's a dialogue between or among persons or quasi-personified beings whose personhood you only are seeing dimly. Because persons are mysterious. They're emblematic of the primary mystery of being. Knowing is never final or perfect. Knowing is listening and responding. It is a conversation. It requires undivided attention, which is the purest form of prayer. And that was what Surya was getting at with the angel of the work to be made. This account of attention to the countless persons who populate the world is as close to a theory of society or philosophy of nature as Corbin ever gives us. The archetype of this prayerful attention and dialogue is revealed in the second of those three pivotal moments in Corbin's work. This occurs in his account of Theophanic Prayer in Ibn Arabi, in a chapter entitled Man's Prayer and God's Prayer. This prayer and dialogue is, quote, the highest form, the supreme act of the creative imagination. And this is because prayer is not a request for something. It's the expression of a mode of being, a means of existing and of causing to exist. That is, a means of causing the God who reveals himself to appear and seeing him, not, to be sure, in his essence, but in the form which precisely he reveals by revealing himself by and to that form. There's this really awkward discussion of that two-in-one dialogue. The intimate inner liturgical action required, he says, is a musical duet in two alternating voices, one human, the other divine. The term Corbin uses for this duet sounds a bit strange to many today. Psalmody, the liturgical singing of the Psalms. Here it expresses an interiorization and individualization of that public liturgical display. In these pages, Corbin is clear that while such intimate music implies at its apogee a mental theophany, it is capable of different degrees. This reminds us that its range extends to include the heliotrope's hymn to its king, such as it is within the power of a plant to sing, as well as all the parallel hierarchy beings vying with one another in their religious ascents. Throughout Corbin's writings, it's clear that the material world is not in itself fallen, but only appears so until we've become capable of seeing it in its luminous state, which is its fulfillment and plenitude. It would be a stretch to suggest that Corbin was an ecological thinker, but it isn't hard to read him as if he were. Angelomorphosis does not free us from the world like luminous projectiles shooting towards heaven. It frees us for the world in all its beauty and diversity. An anthropocentric view of angelicity is as foreign to this theology as is an anthropocentric view of God. The paradox of monotheism is not only that the one God must appear in an uncountable array of divine human individuations, it requires the multiplicity of all creation. The third panel in my Corbin triptych also occurs in the book on Ibn Arabi. This extraordinary account of the creation myth, which we've encountered earlier, is worth quoting at length. To begin with, a divine being alone in his unconditioned essence, of which we know only one thing, precisely the sadness of the primordial solitude that makes him yearn to be revealed in beings who manifest him to himself, insofar as he manifests to them. The divine breathing exhales the sigh of extensiating compassion. This sigh gives rise to the entire subtle mass of the primordial existentiation termed cloud. This cloud receives all forms and at the same time gives beings their forms. It is active and passive, receptive and creative. It is the absolute, unconditioned imagination. In this cloud are manifested all the forms of being, from the highest archangels to the minerals of inorganic nature. I'm still quoting from Corbin. Thus, creation is an act of the divine primordial imagination. Correlatively, he says, if there were not within us that same power of imagination, none of what we show ourselves would be manifest. There would be no world. This is really quite astonishing. The imagination created the cosmos, and we have within us that same power of imagination. I mean, not the same, it's imagination. The cosmic harmonics that are its expression evoke sadness, love, and desire. The breath of the compassionate is the sigh that satisfies that longing for love, mutual recognition, and communion by virtue of the creative act of imagination which causes things to be who they are in relation to their personal origin. And we can only perceive them as such because we are able to show them to ourselves. Our experience is reflexive, reflective, dialogical, and communal. It is imagination itself, active and passive, receptive and creative. We see what we are able to see. We experience what we are capable of experiencing. And as we transform, so does our world. Or rather, there's no wall between the two. Subject and object, self and world are all delusions. Imagination, enacted imagination, dissolves those boundaries, and indeed all of the schisms that split the West, as Corbin says. That's why the idea of the middle voice is so important for him. We don't have that grammatical form in English. We have active verbs and passive verbs, as you would expect of a culture where subjects are pitted against objects and against other subjects. That has to go if we're to become capable of the world and of God. The middle voice is a conjugation of mutuality, of reflexivity. It's the verb form of epic poetry, as when the Homeric bard sings, "Sing to me, O muse, sing in me, through me, as I sing your song." In 1951 at Eranos, Corbin delivered Cyclical Time in Mazdaism and Ismailism. He made a pretty remarkable claim. Even when one is materially present in this world, there is a mode of being in paradise. This, we discover in a footnote, is a state of lucidity accomplished by the secret of tahwil. It is possible only when a person is this paradise. In such a case, he says, every verb is conjugated in the middle voice. Then, with a typical Corbinian flourish, he gives us this in parentheses, e.g., the apophanesthai, in Greek, of the phenomenology, which shows itself the phenomenon. This parenthetical observation is an oblique reference to Heidegger's Being and Time, page 33 of the German, where Heidegger is commenting on Aristotle's De Interpretatione, which in Greek is perihermeneus, or on hermeneutics, and is setting out his own vision of hermeneutic phenomenology as letting beings be seen in their unconcealedness. Apophanesthai is Greek for appearance, and it is conjugated here, I am told, in the middle voice. Corbin said late in his life that Heidegger's explanation of hermeneutics had been the key that unlocked the door to other levels of being. His copy of Being and Time was glossed in Arabic and Persian. Hossein Nasr, who knew Corbin in Tehran, said Corbin used to translate phenomenology to the Persian-speaking students as kashf al-majub, literally rending asunder of the veil to reveal the hidden essence, and considered his method to be spiritual hermeneutics as understood in classical Sufi and Shiite thought. In any case, it's this confluence of modes of being in the action of the middle voice, which is the basis for spiritual hermeneutics, the tahwil. Corbin finishes the paragraph with this: the person in whom his own action is incarnated is the significatio passiva of his action. That is to say, he is what his action makes him be. The use of the incarnated is significant. We don't need God incarnate precisely because the nature of imagination activated in the way we're discussing. And as we discover in another footnote to the second part of creative imagination, which was a talk given at Eros in '56, this is a reference to Luther's transformational realization that justice, holiness, and so on are not his, but God's acting through him. Corbin says Luther's entire personal theology resulted from this experience, much in the same way that Heidegger's apophanesthai triggered Corbin's. So you see what reading Corbin will do to you. What he's saying is so magnificent. Imagination allows us to live within that sigh, that sonorous space, which is the breath of the compassionate. That mode of being is the tahwil, which is, he says, the mainspring of every spirituality in the measure to which it furnishes the means of going beyond all conformisms, all servitudes to the letter, all opinions ready-made. This freedom from servitudes to the letter, from that is to say fundamentalisms, is found in that cloud of the imagination, that creative breath that's the source of all things. The circulation of the breath is the fundamental cycle active in this vision, the two arrows. The image is of a twofold intradivine movement of creation and return, an epic drama of descent and ascent. In Corbin's difficult but beautiful prose, if we consider the creature in relation to the creator, we shall say that the divine being descends towards concrete individualizations and is epiphanized in them. Inversely, if we consider these individualizations in their epiphanic function, we shall say that they rise, that they ascend towards him. And their ascending movement never ceases because the divine descent never ceases. That is why the other world already exists in this world. It exists in every moment in relation to every being. In a talk delivered in Tehran in 1976, The Message of Iranian Philosophy, Corbin concludes with a long homage to Rilke, saying that his Duino elegies formulate exactly, literally, what we have been trying to say. Rilke gets it right also in the sonnets to Orpheus, written during the same weeks in 1922. Here's Sonnet 1 of Part 2 in Stephen Mitchell's English version. Breathing, you invisible poem, complete interchange of our own essence with world space. You counterweight in which I rhythmically happen, single wave motion whose gradual sea I am, you most inclusive of all our possible seas. Space has grown warm. How many regions in space have already been inside me? There are winds that seem like my wandering sun. Do you recognize me, air? Full of places I once absorbed? You who were the smooth bark, the roundness, and the leaf of my words. The end.